What you avoid is what controls you. The strange power of avoidance. Most people think control comes from the things they actively choose, their habits, routines, goals, and decisions. But sometimes the strongest influence over someone's life comes from the things they avoid instead. Difficult conversations, uncomfortable emotions, uncertainty, failure, rejection, even small things like opening an email or starting a task that feels mentally heavy. At first, avoidance feels harmless because it creates temporary relief. You delay the discomfort and move on with your day. But over time, something strange starts happening. The thing being avoided slowly gains more psychological power precisely because it keeps being avoided. Why avoidance feels good at first? The difficult part is that avoidance works temporarily. That's why it becomes so easy to repeat. You avoid something stressful and immediately feel relief. Your brain remembers that relief very quickly. This is interesting because the brain is not always trying to help you grow. A lot of the time, it is simply trying to reduce discomfort as efficiently as possible. So even when avoidance creates bigger problems later, the short-term emotional relief still reinforces the behavior. That cycle can continue quietly for years, without someone fully noticing how much it shapes their decisions. A feeling that happens during everyday life. I've noticed this with school assignments before. Sometimes one task feels mentally heavier than everything else, so you keep putting it off while doing smaller, easier things instead. Technically, you're still being productive, but the avoided task stays in the background the entire time. And strangely, the longer you avoid it, the more intimidating it starts feeling. By the end, the stress from avoiding the task becomes worse than the task itself probably would have been. That pattern shows up in much bigger parts of life too. Why avoided things grow mentally? What people avoid often expands psychologically, not always in reality, but in perception. A conversation becomes scarier before it even happens. A decision becomes heavier the longer it's delayed. Fear grows in the empty space where direct experience should have been. This raises a question: how much suffering comes from actual difficulty, and how much comes from anticipation built through avoidance? Sometimes the imagined version becomes larger than reality itself. The difference between rest and escaping. Not all stepping away is unhealthy, obviously. Rest matters. Recovery matters. Taking space can be necessary sometimes, but avoidance feels different internally. There's usually tension underneath it. Something still exists in the background waiting for you. That lingering mental pressure is part of what makes avoidance so exhausting long-term. Even while trying to escape discomfort, your brain continues carrying awareness of the unresolved thing underneath everything else. Why avoidance quietly shapes identity. Over time, repeated avoidance starts affecting self-perception too. If someone constantly avoids conflict, they may start seeing themselves as incapable of handling confrontation. If someone repeatedly avoids failure, they may stop taking opportunities entirely. Eventually, the avoidance stops being a behavior and starts becoming part of identity. That's the part that feels dangerous, because now the person is not only avoiding situations, they are building a version of themselves around avoidance patterns. The internet makes avoidance easier than ever. Modern life makes distraction incredibly accessible. The second discomfort appears, there are endless ways to escape attention from it. Scrolling, videos, notifications, entertainment, constant stimulation. None of those things are automatically bad, obviously, but they make emotional avoidance easier to maintain continuously. Sometimes people are not actually relaxing. They are delaying contact with uncomfortable thoughts by staying constantly mentally occupied. And honestly, most people probably do this more than they realize. Why fear often shrinks after direct action. One strange thing about avoidance is that the fear usually decreases after direct engagement finally happens. The conversation ends up less catastrophic than imagined. The task becomes manageable once started. The uncertainty becomes clearer once confronted directly. This is interesting because the anticipation phase often creates more suffering than the event itself, but avoidance prevents people from discovering that early enough, so the fear remains exaggerated mentally. The relationship between control and confrontation. People often want confidence before taking action, but confidence usually develops after repeated confrontation, not before it. That feels backwards initially. Most people wait until they feel emotionally ready, but emotional readiness often appears through action itself. The brain learns safety through experience more than through thinking alone. Avoidance interrupts that learning process completely. So the avoided thing keeps feeling threatening because the brain never gets updated information from direct experience. Why small avoidance patterns matter to... This does not only apply to huge fears or major life decisions. Small avoidance patterns shape daily life constantly. Avoiding difficult feedback, avoiding health checkups, avoiding honest conversations, avoiding starting something uncertain. Individually, these moments seem minor, but repeated over time, they slowly influence confidence, identity, and emotional freedom in ways people don't always notice immediately. Patterns matter more than isolated moments. The part that feels personally uncomfortable, honestly, this topic becomes uncomfortable once you realize everyone has avoidance patterns somewhere. Some are obvious. Others are subtle enough to look normal from the outside. People often judge avoidance in others while barely recognizing it in themselves. But once you start paying attention, you notice how often decisions are shaped by trying to reduce discomfort rather than move toward truth or growth. That realization changes how you look at behavior completely. Why awareness changes the dynamic. Awareness does not instantly remove avoidance, but it changes the relationship with it. Instead of automatically escaping discomfort, you start noticing the pattern itself. Why does this situation feel threatening? What exactly am I trying not to experience right now? Sometimes simply asking those questions interrupts the automatic cycle enough to create a different response. And that small pause matters more than people think. The strange freedom on the other side of discomfort. One thing that becomes clear over time is that avoided things often hold disproportionate power only while they remain avoided. Once confronted directly, many of them shrink psychologically. Not always completely. Some situations are genuinely difficult, but uncertainty usually becomes more manageable once reality replaces imagination. That's probably why direct action often feels strangely freeing afterward, even when the experience itself was uncomfortable. Final thoughts. What people avoid often gains psychological control precisely because it remains unchallenged. Avoidance creates temporary emotional relief, but over time it strengthens fear, uncertainty, and limitation underneath the surface. The brain learns safety through direct experience, not endless anticipation. And once you recognize how much avoidance shapes behavior, it becomes easier to understand why confronting uncomfortable things often creates more freedom than escaping them. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to learn more.